That is for you guys. I know.
It's like, I just want to drink your water.
No, we don't get one. You do. We don't know. What kind of, in this economy, 2 water?
That's right.
We were joking that yesterday because the London Fireworks is so expensive.
Yes, yeah, that's the closest grocery
Yes,
store.
in 20 minutes. And we came back. So $3 for an apple. I'm like, an apple in this economy?
What's a banana cost? $10?
Yeah, what could a banana cost, Michael? $10.
That's right. It probably does actually cost.
Yes, I know, exactly.
I bought
Lucille
some
was
the
just
other day, I
pressing.
don't want to look.
Yeah. You're going to look at All right, so let's get started. Good evening and welcome to Majors and Quinn. My name is Michael. I'm a bookseller here, and I'm so pleased you'll be joining us to celebrate Cathy Coates' book, To Banish Forever. A few housekeeping things before we get on. Tonight, you will be hearing from Cathy. Then there will be time at the end of the program for audience questions. After Q&A, we will walk over to the signing table, which you will know by us going over to the signing table, but it's the rare books table if you've been here before. You may line up there to say hello, get a signed copy of the book. If you buy a book here this evening, you are not only supporting the author, but also a locally owned independent bookstore, and we cannot thank you enough. This book is amazing, and you're going to want to hear every single word of it, so to it, turn off your cell phone. And finally, please allow me to introduce our guest, who has a blessedly short bio. Cathy Coates is a metadata specialist at the University of Minnesota Libraries. She previously worked at the James W. Miller Learning Resource Center at St. Cloud State University. She lives in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Cathy Coates.
So we thought that we'd start with a reading first, and so the reading that I'm going to read from is from the introduction partly, and then also from chapter 5, and it has to do with the ritual, which is, if you know what the book is about, it's about a secret society that targeted Ho-Chunk people in Mankato, Minnesota, right after the U.S.-Dakota War. And they had a ritual document that they used at their meetings to sort of say their oath and initiate new members and things like that. And that's one of the sources that I found at Mankato State University. It's one of my primary sources. And I talk about that in the book a little bit, and so I'm going to read from you, starting from the intro. On May 3rd, 1958, leaders at Mankato State College held a ceremony to open a time capsule that had lain inside the cornerstone of the university's historic old main building for a century. Inside the box, along with other documents of 1860s Minnesota, was a copy of the Knights of the Forest Ritual, a 4-page pamphlet detailing initiation rites into the secret society and its oath. Mankato citizens had first sealed the time capsule inside the cornerstone of the old main building at the Mankato Normal School on June 22, 1869, during a large dedication ceremony featuring fraternal organizations. A procession had traveled down Front Street, the main street in Mankato. At the parade's end, the crowd of 12 to 1,500 people waited to observe a musical performance. A reading of the contents of the time capsule box and the laying of the cornerstone according to the impressive ceremonies of the Oddfellows conducted by Noble Grand Sheldon S.F. Barney. It is quite likely that numerous members of the Knights of the Forest attended the 1869 cornerstone ceremony. This short-lived but influential secret society existed in Mankato and surrounding communities during the early months of 1863, immediately following the U.S.-Dakota War and the execution of 38 Dakota soldiers in Mankato. Its ritual contains the script for its opening ceremonies and initiation rites. The text of the group's membership oath promised to bind the men, quote, together as brothers in common interests, so they could go forth, quote, stronger and braver in the determination to banish forever from our beautiful state every Indian who desecrates our soil, unquote. The organization's goal was to provoke the removal of the Ho-Chunk Nation from its reservation in Blue Earth County and open the reservation to white ownership. Newspaper accounts published decades later allege that many of the area's prominent men were among the group's members. Asa Barney, John F. Meager and Charles A. Chapman disclosed their membership, and John J. Porter Jr. was featured in his obituary. Other likely members include Asa Barney's brother Sheldon, who presided over the cornerstone ceremony, and John J. Porter Jr.'s father, John J. Porter Sr., who was a vocal advocate for Ho-Chunk removal. As Mankato's leading citizens locked away the initiation rites and oath in the time capsule that day, marking it as a piece of the city's history worthy of preservation, they also locked away its compelling evidence of Minnesota's unexamined history of hate. No other copies of the document are known to exist. Scholars have recently begun to uncover more details of ethnic cleansing and genocide of indigenous people throughout the United States in the 19th century. Studies of paramilitary groups, along with research on 19th century secret societies, have shown us that American frontiersmen organized locally on behalf of the nation's expansionist agenda, known as Manifest Destiny, and were often the main drivers of ethnic cleansing. These narratives challenge the idea of the government as a sole actor of dispossession. Minnesota's history is no different. Until recently, very few Minnesota historians have presented the history of state removal efforts as ethnic cleansing that was encouraged, organized, and enacted by white settler colonists. The initiation ritual of the Knights of the Forest and the oath of its members were dedicated to a general anti-Indian sentiment and political allegiance. But all first-hand descriptions of the existence and participation in the group center show that it focused exclusively on the nearby Ho-Chunk Reservation. These Mankato men were not concerned with the removal of Dakota people from nearby Brown County, which was already assured at this time. The Knights of the Forest organized after the Dakota hangings, after the government had already taken most of the Dakota people in Minnesota to a concentration camp at Fort Snelling. Even before the Ho-Chunk were moved to the reservation on the Blue Earth River in 1855, most white settlers in Blue Earth County had vigorously opposed the reservation and had advocated, agitated, and organized for Ho-Chunk removal from Minnesota. Furthermore, the group existed only until federal government forced the Ho-Chunk to leave the state. The men in Mankato took advantage of the post-war racialized rhetoric and settlers' hysteria to push the federal government into finally exiling the Ho-Chunk along with the Dakota. Following the U.S.-Dakota War, in the fall of 1862 and the winter of 1863, a statewide call for extermination of, quote, all Indians by the white settlers and the threat of a post-war mob violence in Mankato was a constant issue for federal and state authorities. Masses of men held secret meetings and traveled from New Ulm, St. Peter, and all over Brown County to Mankato, threatening to attack Dakota prisoners. Their execution in December publicly enacted and seemed to satisfy the desire for revenge among New Ulm and Brown County settlers who had fought battles with Dakota men close to their homes. But the men of Blue Earth County who had not experienced conflicts with Ho-Chunk near their homes still had the reservation in their midst. Therefore, in January 1863, they organized a campaign for ethnic cleansing in Minnesota. The Knights' impact on the Ho-Chunk people went beyond their forced removal from Minnesota, however. The Knights of the Forest identified itself as a secret society, but it advanced the agenda typical of a hate group, perpetuating a culture of ethnic cleansing. Like other hate groups, its members used political power, intimidation, and racial intolerance to promote their cause, but they cloaked themselves in the rhetoric of noble defense. Because the group's emphasis on secrecy, telling this story requires careful reading of fragmentary evidence. Reasonable suppositions, with the context provided by other secret societies, allow a glimpse of the organization's efforts, members, and effects. Ho-Chunk people had already attempted a variety of diplomatic tactics before the government officials obtained the last of their homelands, so they had a long history of broken treaties with the United States before their arrival in Blue Earth County. The American pattern of deception, colonization, conflict, anti-Indian sentiment, coercion, confinement, and removal was old news to them by the time the U.S.-Dakota War commenced in 1862. Although decades of repeated military roundups had forced most Ho-Chunk people from their homelands at gunpoint, hundreds of families remained in Wisconsin. The blemished and complicated record of the Wisconsin Ho-Chunk removals continued and intensified in Minnesota as American expansion and pre-Civil War discord took hold of the nation. And then later in chapter 5, I write again about the ritual. The ritual document of the Knights of the Forest displays the singularity of its objective, as well as its members' fear-mongering political opportunism. It lays out no goals, questions, promises, or statements pertaining to any other subject other than Indian removal. The politicians in Porter Sr. and Meager must have been especially mindful of the part where members took an oath to, quote, sacrifice every political and other preference to accomplish their goals. Each member vowed that he would not, quote, aid or assist in any manner to elect to office in this state or the United States any person outside this order who will not publicly or privately pledge himself, unquote, to the removal of Indians from Minnesota. The known Knights of the Forest in Mankato Lodge were Democrats. However, the careful phrasing of the oath left the door open for Republicans to join, since their candidates were just as anti-Indian as the opposing Democrats. In 1916, Charles A. Chapman described the Knights' recruitment techniques in his signed article, The Secret Society of Early Mankato. When a person was, quote, known to be in sympathy with the objects of the order, he was approached by a member who, in the course of conversation, asked him casually what he would think of the formation of a society. Prospective candidates were surrounded so that he might not even notice the lodge should he back down, unquote. The recruit would be invited to the meeting to discuss this proposition, where he was met by a committee. And Chapman said, not till he was questioned by the committee was he sent out for that purpose did it dawn on him that he was entering an established lodge. A surprise initiation into the group then took place. The newcomer would swear an oath stating, I, in their name, of my own free will and accord, in the full belief that every Indian should be removed from the state by the memory of the inhuman cruelties perpetrated upon defenseless citizens, and in the presence of the members of this order here assembled, do most solemnly promise, without any mental reservation whatever, to use every exertion and influence in my power to cause the removal of all tribes of Indians from the state of Minnesota. Members were then instructed, quote, to remember that one of the great duties of your life is not only to advocate the banishment of all Indians from this state, but to prevail on others to do so. This rite of passage probably took place dozens of times, given the multiple chapters throughout the county. The Knights justified the organization's existence as a fight for their very survival. During initiation, the worthy vice chancellor reminded the recruits that many lives had been lost to the Dakota and declared, quote, the white man and the Indians cannot dwell together in peace and harmony. New initiates were commended because they had, quote, chosen the only path which will give security and safety to the future and prevent the blow of the glittering knife and the merciless tomahawk. Their ceremonial promises, oaths, and goals focused on a generic image of an Indian. This terminology and the battle imagery contained in the oath combines the Dakota and the Ho-Chunk people into one enemy group. In fact, if the initiation rites and the oath contained in the ritual document were studied independently from the newspaper articles or any other information about the organization, it could seem as though the group had targeted the already interned Dakota people. The recruits vowed that they would not rest until the entire, quote, accursed race of infuriated demons was driven far away towards the setting sun. The author of the night's ritual probably used the term all Indians intentionally. It is likely that they did favor the removal of all Indians from the state, which would have included the Ojibwe in the north. They may have also been leaving the door open for an expansion of the Knights into the northern part of the state or anywhere else that indigenous people lived. And identifying the peaceable Ho-Chunk people with the Dakota people who had recently participated in hostilities was an argument for removal. The initiation rite contains a promise of confidentiality, and the newspaper articles emphasize the secrecy of the group. Secret societies with a paramilitary or violent association use intrigue and mystery as a sort of dark attempt to influence people and officials through their implied or real threats. The late 19th century Ku Klux Klan needed the confidentiality of a secret society, especially when the Klan members were supported by the law enforcers of the area, because they advocated and engaged in illegal activities like lynching. Members of the Knights may have desired secrecy to protect their reputations, although it is unlikely they were ashamed to have such opinions in 1863 Minnesota. Although Chapman's newspaper articles stressed the Knights' goal to pressure the government, members may have sought secrecy, at least in part because they too advocated unlawful and inhumane activities, such as shooting any Ho-Chunk person they found off their reservation. In addition, secrecy would allow them to seem like they had a larger membership. The 1886 Secret Society article emphasizes the Knights' goal of government pressure. Members knew a mysterious organized threat would wield more power by working openly with a petition. Like all secret societies in the 19th century, quote, its prestige was magnified in the minds of the people and of the government by the secrecy thrown around its proceedings, unquote. The article claims that the, quote, mystery had its effect on the government, and it is very probable that without it, the removal of the Indians might have been delayed for years. Mankato leaders knew very well that the war meant the Ho-Chunk people would eventually leave. The problem for the Knights was that it would not happen fast enough, which is why the article proudly says they prevented the delay of the removal. 4 years before his death, Chapman explained precisely how the secret society functioned in its political movement for forced relocation of the Ho-Chunk nation. Quote, notwithstanding the oath of secrecy, hints of the organization got out and went even to government circles in Washington, exaggerated of course, as they traveled until the U.S. government began to take notice. For many in Congress believed that a general uprising of the people of southern Minnesota was imminent for the purpose of massacring the whole tribe of Winnebagos. Over the years, the people in Mankato had signed petitions, held meetings, and sent letters asking the federal government to move the Ho-Chunk out of Minnesota. They had exhausted every conceivable argument for removal. The U.S.-Dakota War finally gave them the advantage they needed to convince the federal government. The Knights then put forth a threat of mass violence under the guise of wartime fear that the federal government could not ignore. And that's all I have for reading.
We have plenty of time for questions.
Jim.
I was going to ask, what happened to the Knights of the Forest, like, after they had accomplished, their goal? Did they all become KKK members, or did they just kind of fade away, or?
They all stayed in the community. John J. Porter Jr., he moved to the Twin Cities and lived in Minneapolis, like, with his father-in-law. But John J. Porter Sr. stayed in Mankato. They owned various businesses like tanneries and hardware stores, but John Meeker actually ended up owning, he was a partner in the bank, he was a partner in the railroad, he was the hardware store owner, he owned lots of businesses. His name was really big in Mankato. he ended up being a very prominent businessman for the rest of his life in Mankato. And Sheldon Barney is the same. He was a lawyer. They were all politicians for the state government and elected to various levels of government for Mankato. And they all stayed there and did business. They all made money from Winnebago lands, as they say.
What, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, quick follow-up. Was there any attempt by them to keep the name Knights of the Forest or just the group itself going?
Well, I never found anything else about that they kept it. In fact, Charles Chapman says in one article that they ended the group in May after the Ho-Chunk left,
Right.
having no other reason to exist, was the quote
Is that right?
from what he said.
Wow.
And but they did. There is a mention in one of the articles that they had hand signs that they would do, and this was common in fraternal orders back then. The Freemasons had them. So if you were a Texan and you were traveling in Minnesotan, you could find other Freemasons by doing the hand signs or knowing their whatever speech code they had, or they would know secret things. And so the Knights of the Forest had that, and they, in one of the articles, they said years later, decades later, they would recognize other members in town in Mankato based on the hand signs. So, and that tells me that they also didn't know each other in person. They wouldn't so they were people from the small towns maybe coming into Mankato, and they would recognize each other that way. So it tells me that it was a little more widespread than, obviously much more than 4 men, but definitely outside of Mankato more than the 2 chapters that I do know about. So.
Okay.
2 questions. Is there any known instances of violence against Native Americans, or known or suspected instances of violence on Native Americans by Knights?
So, well, John Meager was a captain in the Home Guard. So he technically fought in the Dakota War at New Ulm. He fought in battles. But as far as armed Knights attacking innocent, peaceable Ho-Chunk people at the reservation, I never found any evidence of it. I did find that there was one Ho-Chunk person murdered at the Mississippi River over by the cities for no other reason than being an Indian, was the quote that person, or the agent actually said, reported it to the government. There's lots of quotes from this time, from people saying that they would just murder people without so they would just sort of fly under the radar. So I feel like there might have been some murders that just weren't reported. They flew under the radar, and I think I have a quote in my book about you could kill 10 Indians in them days and no one would even notice or something. That was from a trader, I believe, in northern Minnesota, but it was from that time period, and that was just sort of the general sentiment around. So even though I never found definite proof of a Knight's person or even really any murders happening around the reservation, I scoured all the newspapers looking for any report of Winnebago was found or anything, and I never found any near the reservation. But I like to keep saying that doesn't say that they didn't happen. So the agent didn't have a lot of letters during this time, so I don't know. He did say that he did have soldiers there to protect them, but most of the soldiers, it was questionable if they were protecting them really or not. So he did, so he was aware that they were under threat from the neighbors. The federal agent is the federal government who would be, I don't know if you know anything about that, but the federal agent is sort of like, at the reservations, they would set up agencies, and then each reservation had a federal agent that the federal government would hire, and these agents would switch out every so often with the president usually, or but they would report and they would write letters on what was going on at the reservation. And I spent many hours at a microfilm machine reading all those agency letters in handwriting from 1860 or 1850s even, but during this particular time, during these 3 months, the agent only wrote like 3 or 4 letters, I think, to the government. And he was just sort of desperate to keep them safe and sort of get things ready to move, because it was a lot to move that many thousands of people just move them across country. Back then, you couldn't just, they had to get on a steamship and go to St. Paul and then come back up the Missouri to go to South Dakota. So, and it was a whole mess, really. They didn't have great food and all that. So, that is to say, again, that was a long way to say. I looked and looked. But the other thing I'll say about the argument of genocide and ethnic cleansing and the effect that the Knights had on the Ho-Chunk people is Amy Lonetree, Ho-Chunk historian Amy Lonetree, she wrote about what happened to the Ho-Chunk after they left and how many people died. Just over that one winter, like 500 people died that they know of. Again, it was hard to keep rolls because they would go in and, for the roll enrollment, and then they would go back to Wisconsin, and so really you don't know who was living in Wisconsin and who was living at the reservation. But they know for sure that 500 people died over that winter. And so I think that the loss of life was directly a result of this removal and the Knights of the Forest. So even if they didn't directly murder anybody, what they did caused the death of many, many Ho-Chunk people and a lot of suffering over the winter for them.
And did they ever threaten the Dakota prisoners, the ones who were sent to prison terms or were commuted while they were still in prison in Mankato in 1863? Did they ever threaten them, or were their older efforts focused on the Winnebago?
So the timeline is actually the Knights, they formed, so the Dakota were hung the day after Christmas, the execution happened, and then 1 week later on New Year's Eve, the Knights formed. And so the Dakota were already gone at that point. But before the execution happened, they were in prison in Mankato. And in the book, I write about some attempted attacks. But I don't know if the Knights specifically were involved in that, because it was, the reports were that the men came down from New Ulm in Brown County and attempted to attack the Dakota prisoners while they were in prison. The Mankato men were certainly there and doing something, who knows. Captain, the man in charge of the military at the time, I can't think of his name, he was trying to stop the New Ulm settlers from attacking the Dakota prisoners, and he writes that he had a meeting with the prominent men of Mankato, and he threatened to raise the whole town if he didn't get all these men to back off. And I mean, they were from New Ulm, so I don't know how much pull the Mankato men had over them, but they were, like I said, they were there and they were involved somehow, so I don't know if they were involved in the attempted attack on the prison, but.
Was that man Marshall?
Yes, Marshall.
Was
Yeah.
it Miller?
Miller, yes, Colonel
Yeah.
Miller. Marshall was a different one, yes. Colonel Miller's. Walt Bachman wrote a chapter in a book called Colonel Miller's War, and he talks about Sibley. Sibley was protecting the Dakota who were the families on their way there, and he talks about Colonel Miller, who was protecting the Dakota prisoners, and Marshall was somewhere in there too.
That Marshall was one of his fight protect them.
You're right, and Sibley was protecting them through the soldier, or the prisoners on their way through New Ulm, I think is what it was. Or he was trying to keep the New Ulm's sheriff, who was the sheriff up in Brown County, was sort of getting all the New Ulm men to attack the settlers as they went, or attack the prisoners as they went by New Ulm, and then also once they were in prison, because they were afraid that Lincoln wasn't going to actually follow through with the execution. So, but
how did you get interested in this?
sure.
First, and then decided how much time did you do the research, and then when did you think you had a book?
Sure. So this actually was a project of mine when I was in graduate school, and it was actually I was an undergraduate when I first heard about the Knights of the Forest. I was assigned to read Winona LaDuke's book, Last Standing Woman. It's a fiction book, but she has a chapter in there called The Knights of the Forest. And at the beginning of the chapter, there's a quote from a newspaper, and it's a real quote. And so her book is actually based on, it's a historical fiction, so it's based on real stuff. And about most of what she wrote about the Knights I don't think happened probably, but I was curious about them, and so when I went to graduate school, I was in Mary Wingard's class, and she wrote North Country. So she was my advisor, and she wrote about them. There was just a little paragraph in her book about the Knights of the Forest. So I was fortunate to be in her class, and she encouraged me to go down to Mankato, and I went to the archives, and I found the ritual. So, and then I went and started reading all the letters, and I went to the land office she told me to go to, and I started just digging everywhere I could. I read all the newspaper. Like I said, I spent hours of Saturday mornings in the microfilm machine digitizing the newspapers so I could read them later, and the letters from the agent. So it was really a graduate school project, and it was a thesis. My thesis is online, and as soon as it went online, a lot of people read it. I got contacted by the Star Tribune, the Historical Society found it, and Regan was my editor, and she's got a real good nose for Minnesota history, and she'll find it if it's out there. So I worked with Anne, and I made a book proposal, and that was pretty much what I did right out of graduate school. I graduated 2017, the end of 2017, and then started working with Anne on the book proposal right away, and we signed the contract months before the pandemic. So I think I had planned to have it out a couple of years ago, but things. So then at the time during graduate school, I really focused on these guys and how can I find if there was more guys, or was there more chapters, or anything else about if there was murders that happened. Did they actually commit violence, or did they just threaten? Which the County Historical Society seem, they also believe they just mostly were threatening. I think that they probably did actually commit some violence. I think that's my opinion though. But so once the books, I started working on the book, it was really about working with the Ho-Chunk people and doing a better job of fleshing out the history that they wanted to see, and making sure that they were involved in, they would help me, the tribal historic officer helped me with spellings of some of their leader names. There's so many different spellings when you look at the historical records. Henry Sibley didn't know how to spell anybody's name correctly. He did it differently all the time, and Ramsey, and so it's hard to tell, but the tribal historian, he knows, so he would help me that. And another thing that's hard to tell sometimes is they'll have the same names. Little Crow and his dad had the same name. So when you're reading the name in Ho-Chunk language, it's hard to tell if it's the dad or the son or who that is they're talking about. And so Bill, the tribal historic officer, he helped me with that. And I just got feedback from Ho-Chunk people about, what is important to them in their history, what some leaders that they wanted to see talked about. And Dandy was a leader that I added just a paragraph about, but it was really important that he was in there to some of the Ho-Chunk people. So what was another? So just like I said, and working with some of the elders and finding out or some of their government representatives and the way the Ho-Chunk Nation works and the things that they are important to them today, such as being recognized in Minnesota. Even just this book coming out to them, it shows that the Historical Society recognizes them as a part of Minnesota history. Mm-hmm. Those words were said to me several times in different ways by Ho-Chunk people. In the first few weeks my book came out, it seemed like every time I looked at my phone, I would have a friend request or a message on social media from a different Ho-Chunk person thanking me specifically about the ending of the book, where I talk about some of their recognition and some of their issues, or some of the things that they have today that they care about and things. So just making sure I got those important words out there and did the best I could to present the history without, I'm not a Ho-Chunk historian, I'm a Minnesota historian. Bill Quackenbush is the Ho-Chunk historian, and Amy Lone Tree is a Ho-Chunk historian. So, you know, they sort of helped me confirm the research and work into what's important to them, like I said.
So I know you were kind of focused on the 4 names that you found. Were you able to find lists of other people? And then also the question, because that's a very German area, was this a German group, or was it a Swedish group, or was it a mix of people?
So, yes, they all talked about their heritage. Charles Chapman was Welsh, but the 3 of them actually moved from the east, from Pennsylvania and New York, and they were all born out there. And there was and I write about this in the book, there was a rich tradition of different fraternal orders, and some of them were based on sort of workers groups, or like mutual aid societies, or Odd Fellows, or Knights of Columbus, and they were all sort of wanting to be like the Freemasons, basically. And the Irish Catholics weren't allowed to be in the Freemasons. That's I think that's a Pope decree. And so John Meagher is Irish. He was an Irish immigrant, actually. He came over from Ireland at the age of 11, and he was an apprentice to, I want to say, some kind of blacksmith or something in Illinois, and then before he moved to Mankato, and then he owned a hardware store in Mankato, and sort of, you know, became as successful as he was. So, but it's one of the things I write in the book is how some of these fraternal orders were really sort of like a social web. And even if you bring in like the church groups and the other sort of town civic groups, they were very much a social web where, you know, John Meagher couldn't be in the Freemasons, where all the other guys were in the Freemasons, but John Meagher couldn't be. But he could be in the Knights of the Forest, and he could be in Knights of Columbus, or, you know, a handful of other civic organizations. So they were able to have this sort of web. It was like a social web where they would all know, recognize one another from various groups, churches, or you know, or business groups too.
All right. Well, great. Thank you so much. All right, and now the fun part. The buying and signing of books will commence. Once I figure out how to turn this on. I don't know. Who's to say?